3 years. 3 years of small mercies, of cooking for a man who woke from an accident with more fear than anger, of learning the exact way he liked his tea and the precise pitch of his laugh before it turned brittle. 3 years married to Chen Chuo, and the moment the world narrowed to one cruel choice, mother or wife, he chose with a smile. The mahogany table in the family's great room held the divorce papers like a verdict. They lay between them, white and plain, the signatures on top of a life they had promised each other under lantern light. Shen Shong ran a thumb along the edge of the page as if feeling for the warmth of what had been. Behind her, the chandelier threw pearly light over photos of the wedding, their young, halting smiles, Chen Chuo in a suit 2 sizes too big, her in a dress that had been silkier than she deserved. Memory folded into the present with the easy brutality of old film. She could have started from the wedding, the vows, the laughable certainty of 2 people who believed that love could solve everything, but the truth of it leaned in quieter places, the way he always left the last piece of toast on her plate, the little notches of time they stole between a late shift and an early board meeting, the delivery box she still kept in the storeroom as if it were talisman and tomb both. Those small daily moments made the grand gestures possible, and when the quiet disappeared, the grand gestures were the first to go. Once, when his leg ached and sleep avoided him, she had wrapped his knee in a towel, warmed by the radiator and the soft hiss of the city below. He had once held her hand, as if worried she might float away, and she had stayed. That memory, kept almost devotional, hurt now because it proved he had been capable of tenderness. The problem was that tenderness wasn't enough to be a shield. Their house belonged to the Guo family by way of marriage, a stately old residence softened by years of hands that knew the exact shade of the curtains. Guo matriarch, never simply mother-in-law in the neighborhood's gossip, was a woman who had built a life on appearances. Her laugh could fall like a shutter. She could make a room cool by not smiling. When she spoke Shen Shong's name, it was always a measurement. The length of her sleeves, the threadbare quality of a blouse, the origin of a dress. That measuring had started months earlier. A slow, if steady erosion masked by the polite clatter of porcelain. "You know how to keep a house, right? Not that a girl like you should pretend," she had said once, sotto voce at a charity dinner while the cameras focused elsewhere. Chen Chuo had smiled and offered an apologetic squeeze to Shen Shong's hand. Privately, he told her to ignore the old woman, and that it was only talk. But talk had a way of becoming a script. The more Guo matriarch described Shen Shong as an opportunist, the more the household repeated it, not as malice but as fact. Friends began to look at her differently. At dinners, people paused before praising her bread. At social clubs, whispered questions about where she had been until one afternoon 3 years ago, when a photograph surfaced of a newspaper article, an image of a young woman in a delivery uniform handing a package to an address that, apparently, had been a private hospital room. The caption was innocent. "Volunteer," said the headline. The subtext became crueler in the mouths that liked drama. Shen Shong kept the jade necklace in the lining of her sewing kit. It was small and warm against skin, a slim slice of green like a thought unfinished. She had never spoken about where it came from, not because she wanted a mystery, but because some truths, once spoken, cannot be taken back. To Chen Chuo, she had said it was from a family friend. To herself, she had called it inheritance in the quiet, a fiction that made her feel younger and better, as if something in the world still believed in her, even when people did not. The first real crack came at a banquet meant to celebrate the Guo family's latest philanthropic gala. Everyone who mattered was there. Local councillors, investors who brought their smiles like currency, the glossy faces from the morning shows. Shen Shong wore a borrowed dress that Guo matriarch had allowed her that evening because it might do. There was a polite show of generosity in that phrase, but its edge was unmistakable. Chen Chuo stood at her side, the ghost of his earlier tenderness like a private warmth against a public room. The banquet was a choreography of glances and small jokes. The Guo matriarch took center stage when she rose to toast, her voice silk with a steel core. The speech was a masterclass in social annihilation dressed as humor. "My son has always been impulsive," she said, eyes on Chen Chuo as if measuring a wall. "Which is to say, he sees the world through a heart that is easily taken. We all worry about him, of course. He has a robust appetite for life, for surprising friends, for unconventional choices." A ripple of polite laughter followed. Shen Shong's skin felt thinner than it should. She looked at him, his jaw tightened. He reached for her hand, a reflex. She took it, palms damp, and let his fingers close over hers like a promise he was no longer keeping. The rival, Chen Chuo, always immaculate and always smiling with teeth that suggested challenge rather than kindness, leaned forward as if to share a secret. "He married for love," she said with faux sympathy. Though some of us wondered if, in time, it might be love of something else. Guo matriarch tilted her head. "Oh yes, the world is full of roses that turn out to be weeds. We all learn which are which." It was a public unmasking, the sort that left no room for quiet rebuttal. Shen Shong opened her mouth. She had words, fierce and clean, but the room conspired against her. Cameras caught the tilt of her chin, the flash in her eyes. Social feeds would later carry stills of that moment, with captions that narrated her as the interloper, the ambitious girl who had taken a son from a proper family. Chen Chuo's silence swelled like a tide between them. After the banquet, a younger cousin, obedient to the family rhythms, cornered Chen Chuo in the study. Shen Shong watched him cross the room, an animal in a gilded cage. When he returned, his face was careful, limned with the language of damage control. He told her it was only family banter, and that she should not let herself be provoked. He said he was sorry she felt attacked. He did not say, "I should have stopped them." He did not say, "That was wrong." There was a difference between apology and ownership, and it was that difference that would break her. If the banquet carved a public wound, the next discovery turned private betrayal into something sharper. It was not a dramatic scene of lipstick on a collar, no tabloid capture. It was a message on his phone that slipped into her hands by accident when she reached for it to silence an alarm. She had learned the pattern of his devices, the gentle hum, the calendar entries, the work emails that kept him tied to places. The message was casual, the sort that seemed to fold intimacy into triviality. "Last night was unexpectedly sweet. Let's not tell your mother yet. I'm still deciding how much I want to lose." She read it once, twice. Words rearranged themselves as evidence. There was no glamour to the betrayal. It was small, practical, like a needle in fabric. It told her the truth in arithmetic, something given with intent, something concealed intentionally. She did not confront him in the living room or at the banquet, but in the wash of a midnight when light moves differently. She held the phone between them like a third body. Chen Chuo looked at the message and then at her, and painfully he looked away. "It's nothing," he said, because he wanted the truth to be elastic. "It's just work, a mistake with a client." "You brought her into our house," she said. The words were measured, a scalpel. He shuffled uncomfortably. "You told her secrets about our plans, about my family." His face collapsed into that soft guilt that had kept her when his leg had been weak. He reached for her, the same reflexive need to soothe. "I am sorry. It was a bad judgment. You didn't stop them," she said. "You let them humiliate me at the banquet. You let your mother say it in public." He opened his mouth and closed it. The truth had no room in the space he was willing to occupy. There are men who will defend the woman beside them, and men who will step aside to keep the peace. For 3 years she had lived with the knowledge that he could choose peace over her. That night, she learned how cheap that peace could be. The slap came a week later, not from an angry hand, but from the public force of accusation. At a family lunch supposed to be about reconciliation, furnished with cheap flowers and plates that listened, the Guo matriarch did not stop. She rose and told a story about the time Shen Shong had once delivered a missing package to a hospital room where a minor celebrity had been staying, as if that small act meant a whole architecture of deception. She suggested, with the slow cruelty of practice speech, that Shen Shong had been playing a part that men like Chen Chuo could not resist. Chen Chuo laughed like a gently released string. Shen Shong sat at the table as if watching herself from above, listening to words like gravel being poured into a well. The room buzzed with the sound of people rearranging into old alliances. Some of Chen Chuo's cousins raised their eyebrows as if measuring a math problem they had been trained to solve. The family's lawyer, nice enough on the outside, smiled and made notes. None of them looked at her the way she had once been looked at. When Guo matriarch finished, there was a pause so long it became noisy. Chen Chuo stood. Shen Shong straightened involuntarily, expecting him to step between her and that blade of cruelty. He lifted his hands in a gesture meant to calm and smoothed his face into the practiced look of the man who will say, "Now, now, everyone." He spoke not to the matriarch but to the room, placating both. He said they should move on. He said kindness would heal things. He told her, in a private aside as he passed, not to make this into a spectacle. She felt the insult like salt. "You chose peace," she thought. "You chose the room over me." The next morning Chen Chuo left early for work and didn't return that night until dawn, smelling of coffee shops and something floral that wasn't his. Shen Shong waited with the kettle on, as she had for years, the house listening for his footfall. When he came in, it was as if the night had folded him into a different person, more careful, practiced. He kissed her forehead, like a goodbye, like a benediction he could afford, and went to sleep, pressing a distance she didn't recognize. It is strange how a decision can shout louder than a single act of betrayal. The betrayal was one thing. The choice to stand with those who belittled her was another entirely. She began to count small evidences: his lateness, a lipstick on a scarf, a concession when his mother introduced a plan that would humiliate their standing if he did not agree. He did not fight them. He did not tell the cousin to stop speaking. He smiled in a way that meant the word compromise had calcified into cowardice. In the days that followed, Shen Shong made plans that looked calm on paper. She arranged for a lawyer through an old friend of her grandmother's, not because she wanted the war, but because she wanted a line drawn. The first pages of the divorce were signed with hands that trembled slightly. It felt like setting an anchor in a storm. To refuse to be swept away by currents she did not choose. Before she left, there was the small ritual of packing. She folded the dress she'd worn the first year, the one they had laughed about because it made her look like a bride even in winter. She wrapped the jade in tissue and put it in the lining of a tote, then took a delivery box from the storeroom, a cardboard square she had never thrown away because of a habit that clung like grace. She placed it at the door, the symbol of the life she had once been seen to inhabit and now would step away from with intent. A neighbor's child, she had become inexplicably fond of him, handed her a paper crane as if to bless the leaving. He said, "Don't let them take your smile, Miss Shen." The sentence, childish and true, lodged like a point of light. She swallowed and smiled back with the small generosity she had kept for herself. At a quiet hour in the kitchen, when the house sighed and the lights were kind, she sat and wrote 3 lines she would later keep sealed in the bottom drawer of her dresser. "I will not be undone. I will be seen on my own terms. I will not let them make me small." The house was full of voices that night, but none of them were hers. She placed the signed paper on the mahogany table and pushed it toward the center as if making an offering. Chen Chuo watched from the doorway, the distance between them furnishing new truths. He rubbed his thumb along the lip of his wineglass, 1,000 excuses unseen, 100 comforts chosen shamefully. "Are you sure?" he asked, and the question was not the tender hesitation she had once welcomed. It was the query of a man realizing the logistics of his life had been rearranged. "Yes," she said, simple as a closed window. The soft CTA, small and unobtrusive, would have been natural here, if this were a story told between strangers over a screen. She might have said, "If you want to see how she rises, stay with this." But she did not need to address a camera. She needed to shape a future. Still, the audience outside the house would later hear that exact plea, an invitation to watch a woman refuse to disintegrate. She left with the jade and the box and a coat that smelled faintly of detergent. Outside, the city moved like a crowd of small decisions. The late-night taxis honking, the bakeries supplying dawn to the tired, the construction workers who hummed as if the rhythm of the world would not be affected by private grief. She walked into all of it and started a life that had, for the first time since her wedding, only her making. The first weeks after moving out were like learning a new language. There were practical things: rent, a spare room rearranged by an overly solicitous landlady, the delicate diplomacy of answering messages without becoming a spectacle. There was also the way the silence of her home found new edges. She slept on a narrow bed that would never resemble a marital one, drank tea in a chipped mug whose small imperfection she began to love. But no decision exists in isolation. Men and women who have power do not always sleep when others wake. The Guo family was a network of interests. A rumor could travel faster than remorse. Once the divorce became public, tongues that had lapped politely at their wine now sharpened. Investors, always mindful of optics, began to look sideways at projects that involved both families. Contracts that had once seemed steady acquired teeth. Shen Shong heard some of this at a cafe where a friend, Lian, a schoolteacher who had held her hand through the bitter days, gave her a folder with clippings. "They're saying it was your ambition that did this," Lian said, sliding a stack of printed articles across the table. "They're calling you calculated." Shen Shong laughed then, a brief, unsentimental sound. "Calculated," she echoed. The word sat on her tongue like someone else's label. She was not oblivious. She knew how the world read women who acted. She had been called many things. Calculated was kinder, perhaps, than whatever her enemies would say next. Still, she noticed that you could feel a kind of motion when a rumor started. Investments hummed. A board member would clear his throat. A partnership paused. There were brief windows of tenderness from Chen Chuo, texts that read like apologies, folded and cautious. Once, he left a small parcel outside her door. A china cup she had once broken, mended by a hand that had become clumsy with regret. He wrote, "I didn't know how to keep what mattered. I am sorry." She kept the cup on a high shelf for a while and then boxed it away. Regret, she had learned, had a weight that could be carried. If given to the wrong shoulders, it became cruelty or obligation. She was not interested in shouldering his forgiveness. She wanted to be able to look at herself without flinching when she remembered the days he had chosen an easy peace over the more perilous loyalty that might have saved them. Underneath the personal pain there was a practical reality. The Guo matriarch and her network were nimble at social ruin, but less skilled at the hard work of fortifying businesses when investors pulled out. A rumor could bloom into a financial problem if the right investor, mildly skittish and deeply conscious of reputation, decided that the family's current drama made the company a risky asset. These were the eddies of power: reputations, investor confidence, boardroom whispers. Shen Shong had gone from the periphery of these forces to their possible center by virtue of one signed page. In the quiet of her new apartment, she would sometimes rehearse a plan that wasn't revenge so much as repair. If she had been cast as an interloper, perhaps she could rewrite the narrative by letting the facts do the talking. Facts had the advantage of being unsentimental. They were also boring in the way that often allowed them to be devastating. If a plan in her mind required allies, she had a shadow of one, a man who had watched her for months. He was a figure that had hovered at the edge of her story, a boardroom presence whose name she had only ever heard as an honorific, an older man connected to the Shen group. He was not yet a character in her daily life. At most he was a recurring thought. She knew him by reputation, a man who steered investments with a hand like a compass and a stare that measured risk. He had faced the Guo family at several shareholder dinners, had listened to their polished defenses, and occasionally frowned as if counting numbers no one else could see. Her contact with him had been incidental at first. A package delivered to one of his company's subsidiaries during a time when she still wore a delivery uniform. A brief exchange in a corridor where he had asked after a small kindness she had shown his assistant. He had been polite and then, more than polite, quietly attentive. There was nothing dramatic about their interactions, nothing that would justify a sudden kingdom raised for her. Yet in the geography of power, sometimes a small ledge was all a person needed. She did not know then whether she had a claim on him or whether he would be a friend or an instrument. What she did know was that someone of influence had observed her steadiness, and in a game of appearances, an observer could easily become an ally. For now, that possibility existed like a thin thread of silver in a dark weave. She put it out of her mind only to find herself coming back, over and over, to the way he had looked. Not with the curiosity of a man who wanted to own her time, but with the sort of interest that meant a person was being seen. Days went by, and the melody of the city changed only a little. Paper stories and whispers circulated. The Guo matriarch gave a few interviews where she implied nothing directly, but let questions find their own poison. Shen Shong found herself rehearsing the face she would show at future gatherings. Not the woman who had cried in corners, but a person who had found her center. A close friend, May, came with practical kindnesses. Boxes labeled with bright tape, a small mattress delivered in a beat-up van, and assembled in the room like a harbor. May stayed for 2 nights, making soups and listening without offering too many theatrical opinions. "You must be careful," May said once, plucking at the hem of a sweater. "People will try to make you a villain or a saint. Don't let them write the script." Shen Shong learned to say, "I will not be written." A month passed, and then a small boardroom tremor rippled through the Guo family's holdings. An investor quietly withdrew funds from a joint venture that had promised to build a new art complex in a downtown district. It was not a headline-making collapse, no government inquiry, no scandal sheets crying for blood, but the withdrawal was a signal. Money responds to the scent of risk. The Guo accountants made calls, the cousins frowned, and the Guo matriarch, for the first time in public memory, looked less certain when she smiled. In a world that worshipped equilibrium, the fissure made people nervous in ways that were profitable for some and disastrous for others. Shen Shong watched these movements like a chess player learning a new opponent. She had left because she could not live under the sound of the Guo matriarch's judgment. She remained because she was not done with the truth, that a life could be rebuilt, not to spite the people who had hurt her, but to prove that dignity had more stamina than malice. When Chen Chuo called that night, his voice had the rounded shape of someone who wanted to bargain. "Please," he said, and the syllable arrived like a thin rope. "Can we talk?" There are moments when answers need time. She refused the conversation, not out of spite, but because a person deserves to be seen before forgiveness, not after. "Not now," she said instead. "I need to be somewhere safe." He cried once, on the line. The sound was small and real. It would be the first of many times he would come undone, and it would mean something different as the story moved forward. Sometimes an honest cry is the beginning of remorse, and sometimes it is a man confronting the loss of privilege. She locked the phone and put it away, choosing the next step and the dignity of not being a cushion for his regret. That week she ran into the Shen Group's building again, like a ghost retracing steps. On the second-floor corridor she nearly bumped into the man who had once watched her with quiet thoughtfulness. He held a file and a cup of coffee that steamed as if reluctant to let go. He looked at her as a person notices a plant that has been watered after a drought, surprised, approving. "You look well," he said. His voice was a low thing that suggested habit more than flattery. "Thank you," she said. "I'm learning to be." He smiled, and it was not a smile that suggested charity. It was an acknowledgement. He said his name, Shen Song, softly so as if it were not important. She had heard it before at dinners and in the papers, the sort of name that could carry weight in a room without effort. He asked after her welfare and then surprisingly accepted her answer without trying to fix it. For reasons that felt dangerous to name, she felt steadier in his attention than in the flattery of people whose smiles were always on the move. "Come by the office," he said, before the moment fully resolved. "There are things you might find interesting." She did not go that day. She went home and simmered feelings into plans, but the invitation felt like a hinge opening. In the architecture of possibilities, it was a door she now had the right to walk toward. For a long time she had lived in the narrow space between humiliation and endurance. In the weeks after the divorce papers were signed, her life tilted towards something else. Not revenge, so much as the slow work of reclaiming self and making enemies irrelevant. She began to take steps that were both tentative and bold, applying for positions that made her uncomfortable, meeting with a lawyer for not just divorce matters but to understand business, learning terms she had once only overheard. She kept the jade close to her heart as if to remind herself that sometime in the past someone had believed in her in a way that was not conditional on a surname. The story was not, at this point, a neat arc. It was a scattering of decisions that would one day be traceable. The Guo matriarch continued her theater. Chen Yuyi continued to come and go with a smile that was like a blade folded into silk. Chen Chuo oscillated between regret and strategy, regret sometimes winning in late-night sorrow, and strategy reasserting itself under the harsh light of family meetings. One evening, the Guo matriarch sent a letter, formal, oddly gentle in its cruelty, inviting Shen Shong to a family discussion about reconciliation. The temptation to attend was a kind of hunger. Part of her wanted to see the woman who had made life small, to demand an apology in the language of public witness. But Shen Shong recognized the theater for what it was. If there was to be a reckoning, she would want it on terms she set. Instead, she wrote back, If you want to speak of reconciliation, do so in writing. I want no theatrics. Guo matriarch's reply was succinct, as if deciding the next move in chess. We will see, she wrote. At night, when the city went quiet enough to hear your own thinking, Shen Shong sat by the window and watched lights blink across buildings, knowing the story would not end with a signature. She told herself, aloud, that the world was not kinder because of her suffering, but because she refused to let it define her. It was a small victory, the kind that hardly merits mention in dramatic essays, and yet it sustained her. She was not a woman planning a cold revenge. She was an ordinary person learning the architecture of power and how to stand within it without giving up her sense of self. That evening, lost in thought, she strapped the jade to her neck and walked out into the rain, leaving the box under her arm like an old friend. The city smelled of wet asphalt and cigarettes and the clean tang of possibility. She walked until the lights blurred and her shoes were soaked, and the sound of the world decided not to judge her anyway. There would be other battles, boardroom murmurs and investor tremors, whispered phone calls and a delayed project, but those belonged to a later hour. For now the story had a straight, devastating pivot. A woman who had been publicly humiliated, who had found the courage to sign a paper that separated her from a husband's cowardice, and who was beginning to learn that sometimes the most radical act is to refuse to be small. She had left, not in a blaze of drama, but in a slit of small acts, packing the jade, carrying the delivery box once more, telling a neighbor's child not to worry about her smile. She had opened the door to a life that might, in time, be vast. In the dark of her new apartment, she did something she had not done since she was a girl. She wrote a letter to herself she did not intend anyone to read. It was short. I am not the weight of their approval, she wrote. I am not the echo of their laughter. I will build my own table. She folded the note and put it into the cardboard box by her bed. It felt like a covenant. Outside, in a different room of a house that still knew her name, Chen Chuo sat in front of his own mirror and tried to trace where the warmth had gone. He called his mother in the small hours and listened to the rustle of tissue paper and phrases that sounded like instructions. We must manage optics, she said. He found himself agreeing because agreement had been his easiest habit. He did not yet understand the cost. He had not yet seen the way an injured dignity could grow in a woman who refused to be shamed. He had not yet realized that a man who cried often, only once the choices he made had landed him on a floor he could not climb from. For now, there was only a thin, immediate regret that had the feel of a man coming to terms with the arithmetic of loss. But the world had a way of listening to small signals. An investor called a cousin and asked a question about the stability of a venture. A board member hesitated over a signature. A rumor moved into the financial quarters that the Guo family's hold on some projects was weaker than advertised. None of these things were dramatic, yet each was a stone that, placed in sequence, could topple a wall. Shen Shong learned to move like water around those stones. At the end of the month she received a message that was both mundane and strange. Would you consider meeting with Mr. Shen? It was unsigned, taped to an envelope that smelled faintly of ink and old paper. For a moment she considered discarding it. Instead, she held it in her hands and felt the possibility inside like a small pulse. She did not know yet what kind of bargain the world would ask of her. She only knew she would not return to a life where she would be humiliated for the entertainment of others. She would not be the woman who smiled while being measured. And so she stepped, with the jade against her collarbone and the small box in the corner of the room, into a path that would force the Guo family to reckon with more than their gossip. If you want to see how she rises, stay with this. The envelope sat on her kitchen table like a small, careful promise. The handwriting was neat, no flourish, no ornaments. Mr. Shen. On the back, an address and a time. Shen Shong read it twice, then folded it and put it in the pocket nearest her heart, next to the jade. For a woman who had spent weeks learning to be cautious, the decision to go felt like a soft, deliberate revolt. The Shen Group's headquarters smelled of leather and stainless steel, of coffee that had learned the language of money. It was a world she had once delivered into, in a uniform and with steady feet. Now she walked in as a guest. The lobby's glass reflected a woman who had been remade by small resolutions. The same face, yes, but eyes that had learned to measure the room before it measured them. He was waiting in a bright office that overlooked the river. Not the old patriarch she had imagined, though Shen Qingsong's name carried a weight like weather, but a man in his early 40s with a softened austerity. Shen Wei. He wore the company's neat indifference like a second skin, but when he smiled it split into something honest. He stood when she entered and offered a chair with the kind of politeness that suggested he had watched other people refuse her before. "I remember you from a delivery," he said without preamble, as if the fact mattered less than what followed. "You returned something that had been misplaced, an act that doesn't look like much until you think how many people ignore mistakes." She laughed, half surprised. "Small courtesies keep the world together," she said. There was no false modesty in it. It was a principle she'd lived by. What you endured was ugly," he said, looking at her as if reading something careful and tender. There was no patronizing in his voice. "I want to offer you a space here if you'll accept. Not charity, work." She had expected offers before. A loan, an apology, a favor wrapped in the noise of public sympathy. This was different. He described a role that fit the sum of her daily skills and the quiet ways she'd been strong. Community outreach, a fragment of corporate social responsibility that required someone who could move between worlds without losing integrity. Slowly, practical and oddly graceful, he sketched a plan to involve her in a program the Shen Group was launching to support small businesses and women entrepreneurs. He wanted her to lead the pilot not because she was a symbol, but because he believed she could do the work. "And why me?" she asked. "Because you see things others don't," he said simply. "Because you carry more than your title says." Accepting was not immediate. She wanted autonomy, not rescue. The offer, however, came with the conditions she liked: a contract, a salary that would make rent simple, and freedom to shape the program. He did not flinch when she asked about expectations or timelines. He had listened, and the listening was not a way to charm. It was an architecture of respect. Her first days at Shen Group were a study in fitting a softer instrument into a louder orchestra. She learned names of departments and learned to sit in meetings without shrinking. She made notes in a small leather-bound book: who ran procurement, which neighborhoods were underserved, who in the company had influence but would not notice a bribe. She took the jade necklace from the pocket of her coat and touched it when doubt crept in like cold. Shen Wei was careful in the way he let her know she was not a project. He introduced her as a colleague, asked her opinion, and sometimes simply listened, the way a good listener collects details that later become strategy. Around him, people who had once never paused at her name began to pause. Her presence became not an ornament, but a utility. Their respect changed from curiosity to the pragmatic language of co-workers. But power seldom changes hands without a struggle. At the same time she took the job, a quiet storm gathered around the Guo family's businesses. It began in the small ways: a conference call abruptly rescheduled, the tone of investors growing flat, an unexpected audit request from a partner in a joint venture. Shen Wei's team called meetings. His face kept the steady calm of someone who had lived through economic cycles, yet his fingers tapped on the table when he listened. The pattern was not coincidence. When the compliance officer, thin, efficient, and privately furious at sloppy accounting, brought a file to Shen Wei one night, he had been the kind of person who held on to details that others dismissed. "We traced money moving through shell accounts that invisibly touched the Guo projects," he said. He placed a folder between them. Emails, invoice chains, and spreadsheets mapped like a city. Shen Wei read, eyes narrowing. The documents did not scream accusation, they whispered enough to make board members nervous. If the connections were true, padded vendor invoices, favors disguised as payments, they would be embarrassing at best and catastrophic at worst to the Guo family's reputation. He did not want to be the arbiter of ruin, but his position required him to act when risk smelled like fire. "We move strategically," he said. "We don't leak for spectacle. We give them time to respond, and we prepare our own house." They began by asking questions in the polite language of business: a request for clarification, a demand for missing receipts, a board-level review. Shen Wei's restraint was a weapon, a patient pressure that invited partners to explain themselves before being exposed. The Guo family, accustomed to flattery and the soft bribes of social capital, had few answers that would satisfy audits. Their instinct was to smooth, to smile, but money, when watched, revealed seams. At home, the Guo matriarch's hands trembled as she held onto a phone that rang more than it should. She could command a dining room, but not a balance sheet. She called Chen Chuo into the study. "What are you doing?" she hissed, voice low. The luxury of her surroundings made the question sharper. "You married badly. You brought shame." Chen Chuo tried to reply with the calm he had learned as a form of survival. "Mother, these are business matters. We can—" "They are reputational," she cut in. "The partners will look, the papers will write it. Do you see? Do you understand the exposure?" He did. When people close to money realize the smell of danger, their survival instincts can sound like defense. "I'll make calls," he said. He tried to call investors, to placate people who had initially believed his family's steadiness. But Shen Wei's team was deliberate. Questions came from competent people, delays were explained, and an investor who was always conscious of optics pulled a small, previously promised line of funding that had been earmarked for the Guo complex. It was not headline news, but it was a signal. Rumors, like currents, find their way to dry land. The local papers began to ask polite questions. The Guo matriarch's charity gala, once a display of social power, aired thinly now with awkward smiles and few responses. People who had once assumed the family's projects would always be safe began to hedge. Contracts froze. Board members shifted allegiances. The Guo home became a place where every ring of the phone could signify loss. Chen Yuyi's smile started to feel brittle. She had been until then the ideal courtier, pretty, compliant, loyal to the family line. But in public, loyalty is a currency, and when that currency falters, people count their holdings. She stopped returning certain calls, or returned them with a distance that was almost a prelude to rebranding her life. Shen Shong watched the shifts like a player in a game she'd studied from the bleachers. She knew, in the quiet way of someone who had been shamed, how to let rumor do the initial work while truth moved like a river underneath. She watched investors and asked questions, and with Wen's help began to stitch a narrative. The evidence was enough to make people think, and that in the world of money is often enough. When the first formal investor meeting was called, the Guo family's nervousness was visible. Chen Chuo sat at the head of the table, a posture of authority that no longer matched the reality of his leverage. He made small talk. His hands shook when he lifted his coffee. Across from him, representatives from the Shen group asked their questions with surgical politeness. It was not a public indictment, but a professional examination. The Guo side had answers that felt rehearsed. The room smelled of citrus and fear. After the meeting, a young executive from a partner firm took Chen Chuo aside. "We're reconsidering the joint venture," she said quietly. The words were not cruel, they were the blunt geometry of business. Chen Chuo's mouth emptied of color, and for a moment, the man who had once turned toward peace like a reflex felt the sudden cold of consequence. Back at Shen Group, Shen Wei worked with care. There was no gloating in his moves, only a firm sense that the company needed to purge its risk and that the Guo links carried that risk. He discussed plans to restructure shared assets and to distance his firm from potential fallout. It was a business decision, the kind that in the end would ripple into private lives. Word of the investor withdrawal traveled to the Guo household like an animal's whisper. Guo matriarch called Chen Chuo into the library and the conversation was sharp. "You married into us," she said. "You promised to carry our name with honor. You failed." He had begun by then to know the exhaustion of a man whose choices turned out to be poorly placed loyalties. "Mother, I didn't," he started, but her hand came up, a wall. "Do not call me mother in this tone," she said. "You make us look weak." Weak. The word struck him in a way that had nothing to do with physical strength. It struck at his identity. His father, once a figure who had marshaled a modest empire, had taught him to solve problems with charm and connections. Now the charm felt thin and connections creaked. He moved through the day with a new awareness. What he had once thought of as private comfort was in public negotiation. He needed allies. He tried to call Shen Shong. She did not answer. He sent messages that sounded like small apologies, thin threads he seemed to hope she would stitch into forgiveness. He left a note at her apartment, an attempt at an apology that felt more like an expedient. When he came by her place in person, he found the door closed. Her neighbor, a woman with a blunt compassion, told him she had seen Shen Shong entering the Shen building earlier that week. The news landed like cold rain. He stumbled back through the city like a man grasping at the shape of a life that had shifted. There were nights when he would sit in front of the television and cry. The grief was not only for the woman he had lost, but for the status that had thinned around him. Crying is a complicated thing. For him it carried the taste of both remorse and the realization of what his choices had cost. The cries were real, shaky, and full of a man tasting loss. But the world had moved into new arrangements. Tears were not a prescription for repair. Shen Shong, meanwhile, and Shen Wei found a cadence. They worked late on a proposal that would bring microloans and incubators to women in neighborhoods that had been historically overlooked. She designed programs that felt practical and humane, small training classes, mentorship, and seed funds that required sweat and intellect more than a perfect pedigree. She visited markets, met with women who ran stalls out of converted storefronts, and learned the rhythms of a world she had always moved through but now influenced. One evening, as they walked out of a community center, Shen Wei said, "You have a way of making dignity an ordinary thing." She turned to him, the city lights painting him in soft gold. "I learned to protect it when others tried to make it entertainment." There was a pause that was not small. He looked at her as if he had been building up an argument in his head and decided to release it. "There's a difference between using power and earning it," he said. "You've earned yours." She felt something in the way he said it, an acknowledgement that carried a warmth she had not sought but did not mind. It was not love declared in a rush. It was respect moving towards something quieter. She had come to him for work, and work had become a place where two people, both careful, found themselves softening. Meanwhile, the Guo matriarch's world narrowed. Social invitations were fewer. She took calls from people who sounded polite but distant, voices that had practiced regret without offering much in the way of remedy. The family's accountant suggested solutions, cost-cutting, PR spin, but nothing could entirely hide the way money moves when trust slips. Contracts were renegotiated, and the Guo matriarch faced the smallest truth of her life. Public power can be brittle when private networks fail. In a move that tasted of corporate inevitability, the Guo family agreed to reevaluate their holdings. Boards were shuffled. People who had long been willing to be seen with them now paused. The Guo matriarch, who had once used banter as a blade, found herself answering questions about her judgment. In private moments, she reached for the security of her old phrases and found them hollow. There were a few late nights when she stood at the window and watched the city as if trying to summon the applause she had once commanded. Chen Chuo tried to hold the collapsing edifice together with charm and remorse, but charm without accountability is a reed in high wind. He called his mother, pleaded for understanding, offered to fix the mess, if only they would believe his contrition. Instead, she fanned the old embers into a small flame of strategy, find a way to salvage what remained of the family's interests, cut losses, and prepare for consolidation. But losses are not the only currency in human life. There are small acts that reconfigure fate. One night a journalist called with a question about an anonymous tip. What had been the source of the withdrawal? The journalist was persistent, and when pressed, the Guo spokespeople offered a practiced answer: rumors and restructuring. The public accepted it, in part, because corporate crises are sometimes boring. The private damage, however, had already been done. One of the more painful consequences for Chen Chuo was social. Old friends stopped showing up for dinner invitations. A cousin asked to be removed from a project. The small dignities that had once cushioned him evaporated in a week of quiet retractions. He tried to see Shen Shong once more, to apologize in a way that felt sincere and not simply an attempt to restore his reputation. He found her office door locked. He stood across the glass and watched her through a pane with a dignity she had newly acquired. She was with a group of small businesswomen, laughing in the way that says, without pride, that life continues. That image, of her alive and moving on, punctured him with more force than any public rebuke. He retreated to a room where he could no longer pretend to the old ease and cried until he could do nothing else. When the invitation for a reconciliation dinner arrived, the Guo matriarch sent a polite note to old acquaintances, an attempt to stitch social fabric that had been torn. News of the dinner spread, and as always in life of social spectacle, the room prepared for drama. But the narrative had shifted. Shen Wei, who had been offered a handshake and a place at the table as a formality, declined. He did not want to reward performance with presence. The absence was a small social punishment. The final crushing public moment came in an expertly timed press release. Shen Group announced a new partnership model that prioritized transparency and responsible investment. It was not aimed solely at the Guo family, but the language, the emphasis on audit, on governance, on refusing to propping networks that blurred lines, was a hint. Investors who had been quietly on the fence decided it was safer to stand with a company that promised clarity rather than one who seemed entangled in social spectacle. When the public pressure coalesced, the Guo family moved on damage control. A consultant suggested an apology to show humility. Another suggested a retreat into philanthropy and quiet. The matriarch, who had once wielded humiliation like a tool, now tried to write an apology that would look sincere. She called Shen Shong. There was a ring of the bell and a trembling voice on the line. "I misjudged you," the matriarch said, and the words were awkward in their attempt to be small. "I have said things I regret." Shen Shong listened. There was a flash of old need, then the new bedrock. She did not need the apology to be public. She did not need it to absolve the cruelty. She needed, she told herself, a dignity preserved. "I accept your words," she said after a pause that was itself a small boundary. "But I do not accept what they cost me," the matriarch's voice caught. For a woman who had used social cruelty to shape her life, the admission was a small earthquake. There were other smaller scenes of consequence. Chen Yuyi tried to pivot careers, taking a role in a firm abroad that would allow her to escape the family shadow. The cousins who once enjoyed shared power found their projects in dispute and their reputations slightly tarnished. It was not a dramatic fall from grace. It was the slow loss that leaves people to reconstruct themselves. Shen Shong's life, by contrast, began to grow into new rooms. The pilot program she ran was successful in small practical measures. A tiny factory found additional buyers thanks to new contacts she had introduced. A market vendor secured a small loan and expanded. A woman got the training she needed to formalize her business and hire help. Small victories, the kind that do not make headlines, accumulated into a quiet respect that breathed around the people she worked with. As respect grew, so did an unexpected closeness with Shen Wei. They shared late coffees and argued about strategy, about whether a program should be aspirational or strictly pragmatic. He admired the way she held herself, a dignity that had been carved out of pain. She admired his steadiness and the fact that he did not perform sympathy. Their connection deepened, not in a montage of romance, but in small, steady acts. Covering for each other when deadlines ran late, sending messages of concern when an unexpected storm delayed a shipment of supplies, leaving a mug of tea on each other's desks with the kind of intimacy that forms in work. One night, after a long meeting, he walked her to her car. The city was late and soft. She touched the jade at her throat as if to remind herself of where she had come from. He hesitated, then said, "I didn't want to offer you a lifeline. I wanted to offer you a choice." She looked at him. "I didn't come to be saved," she said. "I came to be seen." "Then stay seen," he replied. "Stay with what you want." The space between them was honest. He did not promise to erase her pain. He promised to stand beside her, not in a way that would replace her autonomy, but as a partnership that could be chosen freely. She felt the gravity of it. The idea of marriage, once a word that had been tied to humiliation and compromise, took on a new texture, a possibility of mutuality rather than the old bargain. There were practicalities to attend to. A relationship with a public figure is always tangled with public expectations. Shen Wei did not rush her into anything. He met Mei and Lian. He asked the simple question, what did she want? They talked for long evenings, about shame and dignity, about how small acts of cruelty had once defined her life. He told her about his father, about the need for him to steer the company with steadiness and to take responsibility for the culture inside the firm. She listened. The conversations were not cinematic because the work of love seldom is. They were long, sometimes awkward and real. Then the board moved. Shen Song, the patriarch, attended a meeting not to command but to observe. He had been watching the changes in the company, seeing how a person could catalyze both conscience and profit. He respected steady competence and subtle integrity. When Shen Wei, with Wen and other executives, proposed a partnership model that included Shen Shong as a partner in a new foundation arm, the patriarch nodded and offered a quiet blessing. He was a man of few words, but his approval meant more than a headline. It meant structural support that made the partnership not a symbolic gesture but a real pivot. Marriage plans were not hatched in a week. They emerged from months of shared work and mutual respect. Shen Wei asked her, in a private moment, whether she would consider a life together, not as repayment or spectacle, but as a partnership. She took time to consider, to weigh what marriage meant to her now that she had built a life of her own. The complexity of her feelings was real, part practical, part strategic, part tender. She thought of the jade, the delivery box, and the divorce papers she had once signed. She thought of the man who had chosen the room over her and cried. She thought of her neighbors, the women she had helped, and the possibility of a home built by choice rather than compulsion. "You are asking me to marry you," she said to Shen Wei in the hush of his study, the river like a slow ribbon below. "And I am asking myself, is this to close a wound or to open a new door?" "It must be to open a door," he said. "I want to be beside you, not to be the hand that covers you. I will not let you be humiliated again." Her answer, when it came, was neither impulsive nor cold. She chose to marry him because she believed in the kind of life they might have, one in which her dignity would be respected, and in which she could remain the person who built bridges. It was a decision made with eyes wide open. The wedding was not extravagant in the way of old Guo galas. It was, instead, a gathering that signaled the new architecture of alliances. The venue was the Shen family estate, older and more graceful than the Guo home, but the tone was restrained. There were toasts that spoke of partnership and mutual respect, and a handful of small businesswomen, whom Shen Shong had helped, invited as guests of honor. The old matriarch was there too, sit in the back, thinly smiling, perhaps trying to find a place for a dignity that had been bruised. When Chen Chuo heard she would marry Shen Wei, he felt a blade twist inside him. It was not merely jealousy. It was the sense that his life had been superseded by someone who had chosen agency, and that he had been left behind by his own complacency. He tried desperately to reach Shen Shong and failed. He watched the pictures in the paper, her in a simple dress, a thin band of jade visible at her throat, him in the periphery, now a rumor in the social feeds. On the day of the wedding, interior rooms were filled with flowers and calm. Shen Shong wore the dress she had not given up, the one from the early years that had once made her look like a bride on a rainy winter day. The motif of the delivery box, the jade, and the divorce paper threaded through her memory as simple props of a life she had rebuilt. For a moment she allowed herself a private laugh. How tiny decisions can become the bones of a great return. Shen Wei stood before her with a hand that steadied more than it possessed the gesture of authority. When he spoke, his words were a promise. "I will not use my position to silence you," he said. "I will use it to make space for you." They exchanged vows written not to the melodrama of old romantic tales, but to the practical dignity they had both fought to protect. The vows spoke of partnership, of a shared mission, of mutual respect, and of the freedom to choose growth even when grief shadowed the edges. There were small happy tears among guests who had watched her rise. For Shen Shong, the vows sealed a narrative she had rebuilt. Not revenge as vengeance alone, but as the reclamation of a life. Outside the windows, the Guo matriarch watched from across the lawn at a distance. She had tried to arrange her face into something like acceptance. It was not triumph she felt, perhaps a late bitter admiration, but the sensation of watching the table she had once set be remade by someone she had once dismissed. Chen Chuo did not attend. He stood in a small apartment now his alone, and his regret was a living thing that moved inside him. He called, he texted, he left flowers at her old door, gestures that read like someone begging to be understood rather than a person offering repair. He needed to be seen as sorry, to be forgiven, to be given a chance. But some things cannot be restored simply by apology. They require work and proof and sustained change. When he finally saw her afterward, an accidental meeting on a grey street, his hands shook. "Shong," he said, the name a prayer. He looked at her and the man by her side, Shen Wei, who stood with the steady calm of someone who had earned the right to be there. Chen Chuo felt smaller, not because others diminished him, but because he had let go of a thing that had once been his, the promise of mutual defense. He fell silent for a long moment. "I was cowardly," he said. Tears came like a sudden, unbidden rain. He had matured in the currency of regret. "I should have stopped them. I should have told them their words were wrong." Shen Shong listened. There was an ache in her chest, not for the man who had betrayed her, but for the part of him that might have been different. She had once loved him enough to want a different outcome. Now she felt only a deep, compassionate sadness. "I signed the papers," she said quietly, "because I needed a line. Not because I wanted you to be punished, Chen Chuo, but because I needed to reclaim myself." He sank onto a bench, the streetlight throwing his grief into relief. "Can you forgive me?" His voice was small and real. Forgiveness is a complicated gift. She had grown to see that forgiving him outright would not undo the past, nor would withholding it act as a prize. She offered instead a guarded kindness. "I accept your apology," she said. "But I cannot give you what you lost. You have to make a life without relying on other people's indulgence." He wept then in a way that was honest and unperformative. Passers-by might have given him a glance, a moment of pity. The tears were not a performance, they were the price of a man recognizing his own errors. He did not collapse into humiliation for the sake of spectacle. He became, by degrees, a man who would now learn to live with consequence. That is not a neat end, it is the shape of a life bending toward accountability. The Guo matriarch made one last approach, a quiet visit to Shen Shong's office. She came with a small box in her hands, a gesture that did not erase what had been said, but attempted to acknowledge the harm. "I did not understand," she said, older now in ways that softened her edges. "You were always more than I allowed." They spoke in the private hum of the office. Shen Shong listened, and the conversation moved like a careful tide. She accepted the matriarch's words without dissolving into false warmth. It was a kind of closure, not the ecstatic forgiveness of a soap opera, but a real adult acknowledgement of harm. The months after the wedding unfolded like an edited map of the life she had always wanted. Shen Shong remained committed to her work. She became known not as the girl who once delivered packages to grand houses, but as the woman who had opened a small door for others to follow. Her initiatives created new supply chains for small entrepreneurs, and the local press began to cover stories of women who had found stability because of a small loan and some mentorship. She preserved the delivery box as a shrine inside a cabinet at home. It reminded her that dignity often begins with the things we carry and the way we carry them. On a private shelf in her office stood the chipped cup Chen Chuo had once mended and left outside her door. A reminder, not as a relic of a man, but as an artifact of a path she had chosen to close. There is a way to keep pieces of a life without letting them anchor you to what had been. Shen Wei, and she built a partnership that blurred the line between personal and professional, in ways both difficult and honest. He did not make her a symbol, he let her be. And they constructed a life of shared projects, of dinners with friends, and of long conversations about how to use power without crushing the people it touched. When they argued like people who both cared about outcomes and would not flinch from truth. Chen Chuo's face appeared occasionally in the paper, his interviews a touch more humble. He took work that was less public and slowly began to build a life apart from the social edifice he had once inhabited. He had moments of grace and small acts of repair. Volunteering at a community center, apologizing to those he had hurt in ways that were incomplete but real. He cried in private when he thought of what might have been, and those tears tempered in him a quiet resolve to be better. The Guo matriarch faded from the front pages. She still held influence, but learned in private ways that cruelty is a brittle instrument. It takes time and often pain to soften. The story closed in a room that she had built, a study with windows that watched the river and a small shelf of things that reminded her of the path she had traveled. There was the jade at her throat every morning, a warm band of green like an old promise she kept with herself. The delivery box remained in the corner, wrapped not in nostalgia but in gratitude. Gratitude for the skills that had carried her, and for the small acts of kindness that had shown her the way forward. One afternoon, Shen Shong invited Chen Chuo for a cup of tea, not as a reconciliation of their past romantic claim, but as a full stop of a chapter. He came with a hesitance that had grown into a cautious respect. They spoke honestly, without theatrics. He apologized once more, quietly and without expectation. She accepted the apology and offered him a small kindness. "Find the life you want without needing me to be part of the map." He nodded, relief and sorrow folded together. He stood to leave and, for a moment, looked at the jade she had worn since the beginning. "It was always yours," he said, a small admission that had nothing to do with restitution and everything to do with truth. "It was mine because I never let anyone tell me otherwise," she replied. As he walked away, he did not scream or beg. He had learned, too late perhaps, that dignity cannot be retrieved by apologies alone. He had to live by its conditions. The final image was not of triumph as spectacle, but of someone who had taken the long, quiet route to sovereignty. At the end of a long day, before a small dinner of friends, Shen Shong took a delivery box she had kept and left it on a neighbor's doorstep, inside a loaf of bread and a note encouraging the woman to keep going. It was a small gesture, ordinary and perfect. She then touched the jade at her throat and looked out the window at the city she had always loved and sometimes feared. The lights blinked like small promises. She had been humiliated. She had been betrayed. She had signed a piece of paper and walked out. She had found an ally, a partner, and a life of work that fulfilled more than a headline. She had, in choosing herself, rewritten the story that others had drafted for her. He had cried, not as a spectacle but as a man confronting consequence. He had to live with what he'd done. She had built a table of her own, inviting only those who respected the space, and in that table there was room for kindness, for work, and for the quiet dignity that had been her through line. Her victory was not the collapse of others but the remaking of self. The jade caught the lamplight like a small green star, and in it she could see the reflection of a woman who had been small once and had chosen, with steady steps, to become large enough to hold her own life.